Straightforward conversations, no filters, beyond the headlines, just the facts. This is the Newsmaker. Thank you for joining NewsWatch Plus. I'm Lois Calderon. A ceasefire brokered by American President Donald Trump took effect Tuesday, halting the missile attacks between Israel and Iran. Israel's Armed Forces Chief of Staff says the truce means that a significant chapter of the conflict had concluded and that the military would refocus its war against the Hamas in Gaza, which are backed by Iran. But is the campaign against Iran really over? Especially because the U.S. airstrikes did not completely destroy Iran's nuclear capability and only set it back by a few months, according to U.S. intelligence cited by Reuters. What would a protracted Israel-Iran conflict mean for business? Today's newsmaker, the Executive Director and Trustee of the British Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines, Chris Nelson. Glad you can join us, Chris.
Good morning from London, and thank you very much for the invite, and very pleased to be here on NewsWatch.
Okay, I'll fire away, Chris. The ceasefire between Israel and Iran has calmed anxiety in the oil industry and other markets. Can you give us an idea of the prevailing business sentiment, since a major conflict in the Middle East could trigger oil supply disruptions? Not to mention the fragile truce and fears from initial military intel that Iran's capability to manufacture nuclear weapons remains generally intact,
Sure.
Despite the massive U.S. strikes on nuclear facilities.
Well, I think the prevailing motion, first of all, emotion is uncertainty in general. If you look at what has happened, and I have to raise this in general, the world has become particularly very difficult to plan, particularly if you look at, and I have to bring back to the US tariffs, which keep changing, 90 days extension, rollbacks. This makes it very difficult for people to plan. I also think that what is happening, and I'll be very specific to the Philippines now and the UK, is that they're looking at other opportunities. So, for example, the Philippines is looking to join the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the UK is in that. Why do I say that? Is I think people have to now diversify and look at where they stand regarding US trade. The other point I'd raise, I'm here in London on a PESA investment mission. And of course, there's opportunities for the Philippines as production potentially moves out of China.
We'd like to believe that guns would fall silent between Israel and Iran moving forward. But on the flip side, what is a possible scenario of a protracted conflict or full-blown war restricting the shipping of oil in the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway where a fifth of the world's oil supply passes through?
Well, it's extremely critical. I mean, we haven't seen, obviously, people, if they can recall back to the 1970s when we had the first really significant oil shock and stagflation. I mean, that's what you want to avoid. You want to avoid the situation where the economy is actually in decline, but inflation is actually high. So, of course, you know, this is a very critical time. Oil is just one reflection. It's also potentially disrupting other supplies. Let's not forget, you have the Strait of Hormuz. You also have the number that will then pass by in terms of, you know, the Suez Canal. So overall, critically important. And it comes back also to the fact everybody's been fighting inflation, and inflation has been coming down, and central banks have been cutting. And the companies, of course, need further reduction in interest rates because that will stimulate the economy. So the threat to close the Strait of Hormuz, the potential, is very significant. And obviously the easing of tensions, if this can continue and be broadened into a permanent ceasefire, is going to be very important for business in the context of a very uncertain environment.
You're right there, Chris, because before this Israel-Iran conflict, central banks have been unwinding their tight monetary policy, cutting rates here and there. But then this one is an aggravating factor that could reverse the inflation trend, which is supposedly, which initially was expected to go down. Now, what would that choke point mean for British exporters doing business with the Philippines? Let's go to the specifics, all right? Last Sunday, in wake of the U.S. airstrikes versus Iran's nuclear facilities, it went past $80 per barrel from just between $60 and $75 since late last year. That's about August. Now, there are forecasts as bad as $100 per barrel if the Strait of Hormuz is closed. That price we haven't seen in 3 years since Russia attacked Ukraine. How do those price assumptions affect input costs? I'd like to know, oil would account for how much production of British factories or businesses here in the Philippines, because we have a number of British brands here, right? Like Shell, Unilever, consumer brands, Marks and Spencer, Speedo, Diageo, banks like Standard Chartered, and of course, let's remember, there's the joint venture for oil exploration like the Filipino-British Forum Energy based in London.
I think obviously oil is all imported into the Philippines, so spiking the price of oil has a direct impact on the economy. The other thing which is very important in the Philippines is transportation of goods for people. We know that, so it'll have a significant impact on inflation. So, of course, for Banco Central, for the Department of Finance, who've been working on reducing inflation, and inflation numbers have come down. I mean, May, I think, was down to 1.6, and principally that was food inflation coming down, for which we've also been assisted in the case of pork. I think it's very important. So the Department of Finance, Banco Central, are obviously going to be relieved if Dubai Brent, the benchmark, continues to recede. That will obviously lead to price rollbacks, and more importantly, gives them the opportunity to hopefully have another rate cut, which I think is important. And also, let's not forget the US Fed. The US Fed held rates, but potentially will look to try and reduce later in the year. But of course, they would be monitoring the price of oil and potential impact on the US economy. So all of this is critically important because those interest rate cuts are important to continue to keep the economy growing and to allow companies to obviously reduce their borrowing costs. So it's a very important aspect, and one can only hope that this ceasefire and the overall presence in the Middle East starts to calm down, because these are tensions which the companies don't need, as I said, already in an environment which is very difficult to plan.
All right, you discussed it Chris, in terms of borrowing costs which are needed for to build capital for companies' expansion. But when we think of it in terms of logistic costs, you worked before, you were the head of a multinational cigarette company here in the Philippines before you headed the British Chamber of Business. So can you tell us, like, oil would account for how much of the production cost of that cigarette company you headed before?
Okay, so I was proud to head Philip Morris and now PMFDC. To be very candid, it's a relatively small cost for us because it's a high value item, and obviously, you have a lot of other elements there, duties and taxes. So I think in the case of cigarettes, it's not such a critical factor. I think it's much more important in terms of food products, because food products are obviously a lower cost base. And I think it just is a factor where people can't plan out. And of course, the other thing which we have to be concerned about is the impact on the consumer. Let's not forget the Philippine economy is a consumer-driven economy. And if they feel their costs are going up, the natural reaction of the consumer is to restrict spending, and then that has an overall impact. So specifically in terms of the cigarette business, no, it's not going to have a significant impact because it's a smaller part of our costs, but overall it can affect consumer confidence, which I think is important.
consumer confidence, not to mention, of course, that some of the input costs you will pass, or our companies will pass on to consumers, right?
Correct.
Well, thank you for this insightful conversation. The Executive Director and Trustee of the British Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines, Chris Nelson.
I thank you again for the invitation, and a good day to you and all your viewers. Thank you very much for the invite.
Thank you, and safe travels. We will continue to deliver just the facts and the news you need. Until our next Newsmaker, I'm Lois Calderon.